I'd like to welcome you today. I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome you to this program, The Status of Women in Israel, with Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari. Before we start, I would like to thank the donors who make these programs possible, and we thank Paul Golding and Bonnie Ellinger for their primary support, and also Joseph and Barbara Skybo, Jeannie Negan, and Ted Eastland for their support for this program. What a pleasure it is to have Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari with us today. She's a professor of law at Bar-Ilan University in Israel and the founding director of the Rackman Center for the Advancement of Women's Status of the university. She is one of the most important international authorities on women's rights, having served for many years on the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. Her international awards include being named one of the 100 most influential people in the world on gender policy. Also awards from the U.S. Department of State that gave her the Women of Courage Award. And there are other international awards from Germany and other places. She is a graduate of Yale Law School and has an honorary doctorate from Brandeis University. So it is a pleasure for us to welcome you, Professor Halperin-Kaddari, to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series today, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Ron. It is a pleasure to be with you again, although this time only virtually. We spoke about the last time that I had the privilege of addressing your community in person in Santa Fe. That was just like a minute before COVID started. And since everything that had taken place in the world and in Israel and actually also in the United States, since then, it does seem like a whole different era, even a different life. And actually, my presentation today ties with the presentation that I gave 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And reflecting back, I even looked at the PowerPoint presentation that I used then, and I thought to myself that never in my darkest dreams would I think that we would find ourselves, we inclusively and specifically women in Israel, that we would find ourselves in the situation in which we are today, as I'm going to present to you. And I already warn you that this is not going to be a happy presentation. I know that I will be asked whether I think there is any hope or not. So I will already say that I am not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And I'm hopeful simply because we have no other choice but to keep being hopeful and to keep fighting. So with this prologue, I think we can turn to share screen and share the presentation. And I will be happy to afterwards to send you the full presentation in a PDF format, whoever is interested in that. So the title is Israel's Regime Overhaul, the Judicial Crisis, and the Impact of the War, all joined together, its impact on women. And you can see the logo of the Rackman Center, and also of down below is also the logo of the Forum of Law Professors for Democracy. And I emphasize this forum because we are, I think, a very important force in the fight against, in the protest movement. And I urge all of you to also visit our website and see our position papers and the different analysis that we provide throughout the reform/overhaul. And the motto that really accompanies all my presentations on this subject is that we women in Israel are now facing the biggest threat to our status, to our rights, and to the rights of our daughters ever since the founding of the state. Now, to understand everything that I will be presenting today, we really have to do a very, very brief overview of Israel's system of government. And we were joking before the war, because, of course, when we look back at the past 6 years, it was COVID, then it was the year of the change government, and I'll go through it in a minute, and then the year of the overhaul, constitutional revolution, regime overhaul, judicial reform. Everybody calls it by different names. And then there was October 7, and then 2 years of war and joint trauma, mainly of the hostages and the fight to bring them back. So throughout that year of the reform/revolution, we were joking that we were all engaged in providing a crash course to the Israeli public on constitutional law. And that's what we need to do now in 5 minutes, to explain how Israel is constituted. Israel is a parliamentary democracy with only one chamber, one unicameral parliament. And we do not have a constitution. There is no entrenched constitution in Israel. We do have a number of basic laws, which I'm sure you've all heard about, and they are regarded as a mini constitution, but their constitutional status is heavily disputed, and this is actually one of the very basic elements of the reform/revolution. All this is to say that Israel does not have the common or the traditional or the usual checks and balances, which are to be found in most, if not all, of other liberal democracies in the world, such as a constitution. We do not have a constitution, a written constitution. Many, if not most, of other liberal democracies have 2 legislative houses, so one can oversee the other, one can control, one can have a veto power over the other. There is no presidential veto either. So basically, there is no ability to stop or to control or to check or to overview any legislation. And we do not have a federalist structure. So it is all the power is concentrated in one central regime. We do not have regional elections. Again, all the power is concentrated in one central regime. And we do not have any overarching supranational courts, such as the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the American continent, or such as the European Court of Human Rights over all of Council of Europe countries. And we are not subordinated to any supranational organization, such as the European Union. So basically, what we are left with is a situation where the government is in total control over the parliament. And this is due to quite complex political science reasons that we will not go into now. But the bottom line is that if I was saying just a few minutes ago that there is no power or hardly any power that can control the legislation, what we have to realize is that when I say legislation, I actually mean the governmental legislation, because in recent years in Israel, no law can pass unless it is presented by the government or the government supports it. The government is in total control over the parliament, and the legal system, or actually the judicial system, is really the only effective check on the government. And for that to be an effective check on the government, it must be strong and independent. And this is what the judicial reform slash overhaul slash revolution is really all about. Now, the next slide, I think, is a very good visual demonstration of everything that we already learned in primary school about the theory of separation of powers, which is the prerequisite for a functioning democracy. So the ideal on the left-hand side is these three separate and independent circles: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. In Israel today, as I already said a minute ago, the executive, in fact, swallowed the legislative branch. The parliament is totally paralyzed. The only functioning powers of the parliament are those that are being led, controlled, and led by the coalition parties. And the judicial branch is struggling to keep separate. The legal reforms aim is to have the judicial branch also being swallowed by the executive. And the question to ask is how we got here. And I put here January 23 because January 23 is the date when the reform, when this plan, when this overhaul actually started. So a quick reminder, it all started when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was indicted in 2019 on charges of breach of trust, bribery, and fraud. And we immediately went into a political crisis with 5 rounds of elections in 3 years, culminating, or not culminating, while in the midst of them, in March 21, the opposition joined together against Likud and Netanyahu were able to form a change coalition to oust Netanyahu. But this change coalition was really very, very short-lived, as it was composed of unlikely bedfellows. And we won't go into details in how Netanyahu managed to maneuver the ousting of this change coalition to form in the 5th election round in November 22 to form the most right-wing, extreme, fundamentalist, messianic coalition ever in Israel's history. And in January of 23, Justice Minister Yariv Levin pronounced his plan for the constitutional overhaul of the judicial system. So that's January 23. And to really understand how this coalition was formed and why all the interests aligned together to stand behind this judicial overhaul or judicial reform, we have to put 3 different directions of interest or 3 different venues together. First of all, we have the ultra-Orthodox parties, which hold very long-term grudge against the Supreme Court over the issue of the exemption from military service. And that's what we are actually seeing right now, because the Supreme Court said you can no longer continue with this unconstitutional exemption, which is not entrenched in law. You can no longer continue violate the law and exempt all the ultra-Orthodox men from military service. If you want to do that, you have to have it in a written law passed by the parliament. The parliament is unable to do that. So this is the deadlock in which we find ourselves now. But this explains why the ultra-Orthodox parties stood behind the plan to weaken the judiciary and to weaken the whole legal system and to get into constitutional crisis. Then you have the interests of the religious Zionists, fundamentalists, views of Jewish supremacy, the parties that are composed by what they call themselves the religious Zionism and the Jewish power, and they hold extreme free market neoliberal ideology. But the most important ideology which drives them against the judiciary is the plan to annex the West Bank. And if you had followed throughout the war in Gaza, you had probably seen their calls to actually not just annex the West Bank, but also to take back full control over all of Gaza and deport all the Palestinians, if not worse than that. I don't think I have to go into more details on that. We all know it. And then the third venue that comes together and aligns with this shared interest to weaken the judiciary is, of course, Netanyahu's own personal legal battles, which culminate just now in his recent plea for a pardon. And I put it in quotation marks because legally speaking, it's really not a pardon. A pardon is only when a criminal, even if not already indicted, pleads guilty and asks for pardon. And of course, Netanyahu's whole claim is that it is all a political persecution and a political trial, and he is completely innocent. So this is all by way of background to understand how we got to the reform slash overhaul. Now, what are the elements of this reform plan? It is all focused on a takeover of the judiciary, either by politicizing the judicial appointments or by limiting the possibility of the courts to conduct any judicial review of legislation, or to completely prohibit judicial review of basic laws. And we have to bear in mind that basic laws are not really defined in Israel's constitutional framework. In other words, if the coalition wants, it can pass any law that it wants, such as annex the West Bank, and call it a basic law, and then it would be deemed as a semi-constitution and would be immune from any judicial review. Okay, this is how it works. This is what they plan. This is what they aim to do. So I really don't want to spend too much time on all these elements here, but I think that you get the impression of what is at the aim of this judicial reform or revolution or overhaul. Let me just also draw your attention to the sixth point here, the politicization and the weakening of the Attorney General and the Attorney General's office, all the lawyers who work for the Attorney General, this is what we are witnessing now. So I'm pretty sure that some of you have already been asking themselves, why am I talking now about this reform, overhaul, revolution? Isn't it like, isn't it part of the past? I mean, are we not beyond that? We are beyond October 7. We are at the end of a 2 years war. We are facing the day after in Gaza. And my impression from all the exchanges that I have been having for the past 2 years with Jewish communities out of Israel, and I've done a lot of traveling and talks on account of another issue that I'm involved with, and I'll get to that later. My impression is that many outside Israel are really not aware that we are totally and completely back to October 6 of 2023 with relation to the plan of the taking over of the judiciary and finalizing, going ahead, finalizing the judicial reform, and in fact, moving on to an authoritarian regime. We're completely back to October 6, and the government is really driving there in a much fuller force than before October 7. So talking about the Attorney General, the most important aim for the government in recent months, before, I mean, during the war, of course, was to oust the Attorney General, Gali Baharav-Miara, really the bravest woman in Israel, and actually the bravest person in Israel, to oust her. They had not been succeeding in doing this, but in reality, the government is simply not paying attention to any of the Attorney General's positions, directives, orders, instructions. So it is a kind of de facto ousting of the Attorney General. And this is, of course, another way to describe a constitutional crisis. But let's go on and let's get to the whole issue of women's status within all this that I'm describing. So here you can see photos that remind us of where we've been prior to October 7, the unprecedented protest, resistance movement, led by various professional groups and other groups, including the Law Professors Forum for Democracy that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And we managed to stop some of those plans, but then came October 7. And I really don't think that I need to remind this audience of what happened on October 7. Can see the numbers here and the facts. I will just mention this last bullet about those horrific reports of the sexual violence during the attack that surfaced immediately. And I'm drawing attention specifically to this because this is actually the issue that I found myself totally immersed in ever since October 8. And I will, as I said, I will devote a few minutes to talk about that in a little while. Going back to the coup or to the overhaul, what parts had already passed Now, this is a very, very condensed slide, very legalistic. I'm not going to explain everything that's in it. I will give you the bottom line. Most of the plans to pass laws had not gone through, except for these three that are here. But all these three had also been halted, either by the High Court of Justice, well, not either, all by the High Court of Justice with different tools. The most crucial one is the last bullet below, the law that was passed in March of 25, which is really now, right? 6 months ago. And I'm reminding you, 6 months ago, we were still in the midst of the war in Gaza. Hostages were still held in Gaza. Hostages were still dying in Gaza. And the government was busy passing this amendment to the basic law of the judiciary, which increased the government's control of the judicial appointments, gave the coalition parties a much, much more weight in the committee to appoint judges, and the veto power that the judges in the committee have had. Now, this basic law is going to be debated in front of the High Court of Justice in the next half a year in full court, and we'll see what happens. It is one possibility is that we could already be in an interim government, looking forward to elections. So there's no way of knowing what the court would do in that case. So let's get to women. When we want to understand what this all means for the situation of women, we also have to remind ourselves that women's starting point in Israel had been very low to begin with. We're starting from a very low starting point. There is no civil marriage and divorce in Israel. The formal and informal legal discrimination due to the exclusive jurisdiction of religious law over marriage and divorce has an impact throughout women's rights and women's power in Israeli society, in Israeli families, in Israeli economy. And just to give the one example or one reflection of this is that no Jewish woman can exit her marriage without the agreement and without the willingness of her husband. The divorce, the get, is in total control in the husband's hands. And it is not just Jewish women. It is the patriarchal nature of all religious laws that discriminate against women. And again, one reflection of that is that a woman's right to property in divorce is often being deprived by the religious courts based on the way that they judge the woman's behavior, the woman's morality, the code of modesty that is required of women and not of men. And all this is very often accompanied by a biased interpretation and application of civil laws. And here we have to be minded of the attitude that many civil courts, and not just religious courts, hold against women who report being victims of domestic violence. So claims of domestic violence in divorce are very often dismissed or trivialized, considered situational. So this is the starting point where we started this whole judicial overhaul. And what we have been experiencing in recent years, and much, much, much more so in the past 2 and 3 years, is decreasing rates of representation of women in public life. And I'll show you the numbers in a minute. Increasing gender segregation. This is something that we started talking about and writing about 10 or 15 years ago. And again, never in our wildest dreams would we have envisaged the situation where we would find ourselves now, where women are openly and blatantly being excluded from public spaces, from performances, from public transportation. Women's images in billboards are routinely being torn and being drawn over. Increasing rates of domestic violence, unchanging wage gaps. Let's see the images. So this is an image of the current government, part of the current government. Of course, what is very, very apparent is that there is no woman around the table. In 2020, this is 2023, we're now in 2025, but although we do have little more members of the parliament now, we still have only 6 female ministers out of 35, or actually 36 portfolios, compared with 9 in the last government, in the change government, where there were much, much fewer portfolios. We have only 1 director general in government office. There were more than 10 female director generals. They were all ousted and they were all replaced by religious Jewish males. And again, you can see the images here. No women, simply no women in public office, in influential public office. And the comparative numbers tell the situation as it is. This is taken from the World Economic Forum, the Global Gender Gap Index, the forum that meets in Davos every winter. The numbers here, they go like from the bottom up. So the lowest score is actually the best. So the Nordic countries and Canada will occupy the first 5 runner-ups. And what you can see very, very clearly is that in 2018, Israel was in the first 50. It was number 46 out of 170 something countries that are being examined. Then we went to number 64. So we dropped almost 20 places in just 2 years. And then in 2022, with the change government, we climbed a little bit back to number 60. And then the year of the judicial reform, we dropped by 23 places. And in 2 years, we dropped by 31 places. This is unprecedented. This is really unprecedented in comparative terms. Now, we keep talking about the dangers of weakening the High Court of Justice. Why is it so dangerous for women? What is the history behind it? So here, again, I'm not going to give a whole lecture about each and every one of these precedent-setting cases, but you can just take a quick glance and understand that basically, all the rights that women now have in Israel and that are now being jeopardized, all these rights were actually given by the High Court of Justice or safeguarded by the High Court of Justice. So it really is the most important branch in Israel's political and constitutional and legal framework in protecting and in promoting and in advancing women's rights in Israel. So if the judiciary is going to be, puppet judges, as we can see in this image here, the courts will no longer be able to intervene either in administrative or legislative attacks on women's equality, dignity, and liberty. So, as I said, the coalition, the government, could pass a law, give it a title of basic law, and say that women are excluded from participating from equally participating in academic in academic courses, or that the right to gender segregation in academia is a basic right, it's a constitutional right, and therefore women cannot teach male classes. All these can be passed, and there will not be the possibility for the judiciary to intervene and to strike down such laws. And what I was saying now is really, we, and when I say we, I mean the Rackman Center and other women activists and women's organizations, we warned against it in January of 2023. And to a certain extent, we were very often mocked, even by other women. And we were blamed or accused, we were accused of being too hysteric. You always accuse women of being hysteric. Men are never hysteric. But so we were accused of being alarmists and hysteric and exaggerating and really paying too much attention to trivialization. But what we are seeing now is really an open, clear and open war that Israel's government holds against women. We are now in a record in femicide cases, meaning women being killed, murdered, more than 40 women already this year, which has not ended yet. And when the Committee for Gender Equality in the Parliament wants to hold a session, an emergency session, to discuss these data on the day on November 25th, which is the International Day for Combating Violence Against Women, Minister Ben-Gvir, who is the Minister for Internal Security, forbids his people to go to that session, to appear before the committee, and he does not authorize to hand over any data. And much of the rise in violence, of course, is to be attributed to the outcome of the war and the trauma of so many reservists coming back home, but also to the proliferation of weapons, which Minister Ben-Gvir had authorized right at the beginning of the war under the theory that more weapons on the street is more security for Jewish people in Israel, probably thinking that when you say more security for Jewish people, you don't really include Jewish women or women in general. Now, I haven't even mentioned the expansion in rabbinical courts jurisdiction. 2 weeks ago, one of those laws expanding the jurisdiction of the rabbinical courts had already passed. That law addresses the possibility of rabbinical courts deciding on child support, even when one of the parties, the mother or the father, do not agree to be adjudicated on that matter by the rabbinical court. What is now on the table and is definitely going to pass because it is one of the deals with the ultra-Orthodox parties to secure their support for the budget. So what have they been promised? Of course, they asked for the law that exempts all ultra-Orthodox men from military service. Netanyahu can probably not pass this law right now, but then they were promised other things, including the expansion of the rabbinical court so that they can serve as arbitration forum for any civil matter, including employment matters, including landlord matters, including consumer matters. Rabbinical courts that have no females, no women as judges in the courts. Absolutely exclusion of women, and this authority, this entity is now going to be, the power is going to be expanded, so there will actually be a parallel judicial system to the civil system. And we're talking about purportedly a liberal democracy, probably no longer a democracy in 2025. I'll give you two more anecdotal examples, but they're not really anecdotes. They are reflection of the reality. In the Israeli parliament last week, on the week of the International Day of Combating Violence Against Women, there was an emergency session led by female members of the parliament, Limor Son Har-Melech and others, to discuss celibacy before marriage, to discuss how they can advance this missing a word now, advance this ideal of a woman keeping herself pure until marriage. And by advancing this plan, they did not mean religious women. They meant the plan to advocate for this within all of Israel's society. So this plan is actually directed towards non-religious women, towards the public at large, not the religious communities. Another anecdotal reflection of where we are in terms of women's situation, women's status in Israel today, is that the chair of the Finance Committee is actually a suspected rapist. And when I say suspected rapist, I do not mean unsubstantiated reports or gossip. He was actually questioned under warning by the police just the day before he was appointed to this extremely important position of chairing the Finance Committee. it didn't preclude his being voted by the majority of the members of the parliament. Um, I I think I will skip these, and I just want to mention like and leave a few minutes also for Q&A, and I can stay longer if people are interested. Just to give a very brief how October 7 exasperated and increased all these tensions and all these problematic starting points that I explained before. And there is some paradox there, because maybe some of you recall that women were actually fighting on October 7 side by side with men, and some of these female units in the tanks had extremely impressive achievements, and better than male combatants. And here we can see one of the really greatest heroes or heroines of that awful day. And then on the other hand, we have to recall that it was the young female soldiers whose role was to serve as watchers, as the eyes of the nation, whose warnings were totally dismissed and ignored by their male superiors. And had it not been that way, could very well found ourselves in a different position on October 7. And they're the ones who paid the highest price. I can never forget visiting the war room, which was totally burnt to ashes, where dozens of them found their death on October 7. And then women were victims of sexual violence of October 7. And this is, I already alluded to that, this is what I have been preoccupied with, the fight to combat the denialism of the sexual violence of October 7, to advance the truth and the accountability and the recognition and justice for the victims of the sexual violence of October 7 as part of the DINA project, which is part of the Rackman Center now. And again, I will be happy to send you the slides, and you can also go online and see what we were doing. And then women had also been leading the civil society's campaign for the release of the hostages. You can see all those sit-ins of mothers and women joining the mothers day after day and week after week. And thank goodness we managed to bring all the living ones, except for those that died in captivity. But all this is really put aside when we see what the government is still advancing to cater the coalition's needs at the expense of women. I think I will stop sharing here, and let's take some questions as time allows.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for that information, the coverage. So we do have a number of questions, and Andy Caron asks, can you define the government in Israel? The I think it refers to you were talking in general about the government in
What do I mean when I say government?
yes.
I mean the prime minister and his coalition, his ministers, 36 ministers who form the coalition. It's a coalition government. The system in Israel is a party system. It's a parliamentary party system. There are no direct elections to elect the prime minister. The prime minister is the one who heads the largest party, or rather the party that can form a coalition government. Coalition government meaning they can achieve 61 votes out of 120 members of the parliament. So when I refer to the current government, I refer to the government headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who heads the Likud party. He was elected to head the Likud party. He was not elected as prime minister. He was given the task to form a government by the president based on the fact that his party won the largest number of votes, and he was given the time to manage to secure a majority of 61 or more than 61 members of the parliament from other parties. And he managed to do that by promising those partners, the ultra-Orthodox parties on the one hand, and the right-wing, radical right-wing parties on the other hand, to promise them all those to cater to their interests.
Don Goldstein asks, what can you comment on the legal protections for women in the workplace in terms of issues like salary, promotions, sexual harassment?
So very interestingly, in terms of the legal protections, the de jure, for those of us who are lawyers, so the law on the books is actually quite good. And it's even more advanced than in many states in the United States. There are protections there is a law prohibiting sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is a civil offense and it is a penal crime as well. There are protections against discrimination. There is a law on equal pay for work of equal value. And there are systems that are supposed to enforce all this, but all these systems are being weakened, more and more weakened. And again, we cannot ignore the fact that so much of Israel's budget, justified or unjustified, go for the needs, for the security needs, at the expense of social needs, at the expense of other agencies that need resources so that they can actually enforce those laws. So whenever I show my students the data on the wage gaps in Israel, they're horrified. By the way, we're not that much worse than the US. US wage gaps, gender wage gaps are really bad as well. But we are way behind European countries and other democratic countries.
Judith K. asks, what can those of us in the diaspora do to help this situation?
It's $1 million question.
Yeah.
I think it is time, and I think that it is happening, that communities in the diaspora understand that it is also your responsibility to be involved, even though you do not live in Israel. But what happens now in Israel, the backsliding, the going down the abyss to an authoritarian regime, to a religious theocracy, is impacting all of the Jewish world. And you are seeing it already in rising degrees, in rising anti-Semitism. Now, of course, this is due to a combination of so many factors, and we don't have time to analyze all this. But it also has to do with the face of the Israeli state and what Israel is proclaiming to the world, and what Israeli law is going to say about Jews and non-Jews, and about marriages and divorces, and who can marry and who can become a Jew, is going to impact all of you. And there are ways to be involved. I think you know these ways better than I do. Of course, it is also to support civil society in Israel, support organizations that are doing work, such as the work that I described, but it's not just a question of support. It's more than that.
Halle Faust has a rather long question. We can't read the entire thing, but he's basically asking that must the government, the people in Israel, develop a constitution, and how would you reform the current system given the limitations that it has?
Well, it's like Hillel. I mean, the question that Hillel Hazaken was asked by the the Jew who asked him to teach him all the Torah standing on one leg, right? So I'm not Hillel the elderly. Um, of course, things must change. Of course, basic law, judiciary must change. But before that, a basic law on legislation must be passed, a basic law of legislation that would define what are basic laws and what is the role of the judiciary and what is the possibility of judicial review. All this must be passed, and there has to be reform in many venues, but not in the way that this government is doing, because it is going against every tenet that requires the very, very basic elements that we've seen in the second and third slide of separation of powers. All of the reforms that this government is proposing are going in the direction of making the executive, making the government totally uncontrolled. No way of limiting the governmental power. And that also means entrenching this government. So it's very, very likely that we will have elections in the coming year, and they will be probably free elections, but they will probably no longer be fair elections, because there is nothing to stop the government from passing laws that would limit the possibility of the opposition parties from competing on equal terms. We are already seeing the move to limit the possibility of Arab parties from participating in the elections. And I can give you more examples, but again, we we don't have enough time to cover all this.
Shulamit Reinhardt asks the question.
I could.
Yes, Shula, the founding founder of the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. Yes. And she says, would it be appropriate to say that what is going on in Israel in the transformation of the legal system is analogous to the Sharia law in Islam? So could you comment on that?
Well, it's a very tough question. I wouldn't go as far as stating it in so many words as you suggested. But I have been saying for years, and unfortunately, it is becoming more and more, that Israel is really very, very much part of the geographical region which we find ourselves in terms of the influence of religious law over family law, over personal status of every person, and of course over women. Now, what we are seeing more increasingly in recent years is what we are calling in Hebrew hadata, and I'm trying to think about the appropriate translation to English, more religiosity, but it is a verb, like a verb of making society become more religious and making people become more religious. And obviously, it is due to the growing power of the religious parties, the stronghold that they have over Netanyahu and over the government. And we're seeing it with the expansion of the jurisdiction of the rabbinical courts. Now, Sharia law, I have to admit, gives women much less powers and recognition than Jewish law. And yet there are elements in Jewish law, particularly in family law, where Jewish women's power, especially the way that this law is being interpreted by rabbinical courts now in Israel, is perhaps worse than the power of Muslim sisters. And I'm talking about the possibility to exit marriages, to be free, to start the second chapter in one's life, to have full autonomy over one's lives in marriage and in divorce. So it is sad.
Marja Torben asks something about the background of why wasn't there a constitution developed at the founding of Israel, nor subsequently developed?
Yeah, it's the original sin. Look, I'm not an historian, I'm not a legal historian, but others had researched that and had pointed to the political turmoil that was in place in Israel's formative years. The need to have the support of the religious parties even back then, even though they were much smaller than relatively when compared with Israel's society now. But it was very, very difficult to achieve a consensus and reach a constitution, an agreed upon constitution. Some have been referring, and I'm among them also. It's part of the agenda of the protest movement to view Israel's Declaration of Independence as a constitutional text And the Declaration of Independence obviously guarantees equal rights to every Israeli, regardless of gender, religion, origin, equal rights to all, and freedom of religion, and also free exercise of religion, respect of everyone else's religion. So if one of the suggestions is actually to go back to that founding text and regard that as a basic as a constitution to build upon. Now, I think it was 3 years or 4 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, where the parliament had actually resolved to delegate the powers to to form a constitution to later parliaments, and to do it in subsequent in chunks of basic laws. And this is actually the background to regard those basic laws as some kind of mini constitution or semi-constitution. But long story short, it's the impossibility to achieve consensus or to achieve support of religious parties even back then.
One last question from Vicky Gottlieb. How has this situation for women in Israel impacted the innovations and the economy of the country?
That's also a hard question to answer, especially as I'm not an economist. And there is some enigma here, because on the one hand, we have been downgraded by all the large economic international companies that grade economies in the world. So the downgrading was done in phases, and we're still very much below where we've been before the reform, and of course before the war started. And yet the Israeli stock market had done much, much better than the US stock market. And it seems it's a riddle. It's really a riddle. I belong to those who think that this is very temporary, and that there is no way that we could or will escape an economic crisis in the very near future, especially if we now go to an election year with elections economy, meaning just spending and spending and spending money to increase the support of the voters and buy the support of the parties. So I don't have an explanation as to why is it not yet happening.
Diane Schmidt and some others have commented on the parallels that they're seeing between the United States and Israel in this process. And that's maybe a bigger issue than we can get in at this point. But there are those striking parallels at the same time. So thank you so much for being here today with the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and for giving us this insight as you're experiencing the situation in Israel today. And we look forward to hearing more about the work that you're doing on the DINA project now, which is a very important extension of your previous work.
I said I'll be happy to do that. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the audience for taking the time and being so interested in hearing about us. And I look forward perhaps to further partnering.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you here.